deep in the mountains of Papua New Guinea, where mist clings to the treetops like breath on a cold morning and the jungle never truly sleeps. There's a village so far from the modern world it might as well be on another planet. No roads lead there. No power lines hum overhead. The only sounds are the wind through the palms, the chatter of birds, and the soft voices of people who've lived on this land longer than anyone can remember. This is Karima. For generations, life here moved with the rhythm of the seasons, planting, harvesting, celebrating, mourning. The people knew every trail, every stream, every plant that could heal or harm. They didn't need clocks or phones. The sun told them when to rise. The moon when to rest. They were self-sufficient, proud, and deeply connected to one another. But then something changed. It began quietly. So quietly no one noticed at first. A child wouldn't eat. Another slept all day. At first they thought it was just fatigue from playing too hard or a stomach bug that would pass. But it didn't pass. More children fell sick. Then adults. Fevers spiked. Stomachs cramped. People grew too weak to walk to the fields. The sweet potatoes rotted in the ground. Pigs wandered untended. The village, once full of laughter and the clatter of cooking pots, grew eerily still. The elders gathered under the old banyan tree, the same spot where decisions had been made for 100 years. Their faces were tight with worry. "This isn't like the flu," one said. "It moves too fast. It doesn't care who you are." They tried everything they knew, herbal brews passed down from grandparents, smoke rituals to drive out bad spirits, even fasting and prayer. Nothing worked. One morning, a woman who'd just woven a basket the day before didn't wake up. A young man who carried water for the whole village collapsed on the path and never got up again. Fear crept in, not loud and screaming, but quiet and heavy, like wet earth on a grave. Karima had no clinic. No radio, no way to call for help. The nearest town was 10 days away on foot, through steep ridges, across rivers that turned violent after rain, and past stretches of jungle where getting lost meant never being found. But staying meant watching everyone they loved fade away. So 2 young men stepped forward. One had just become a father. His baby hadn't even cut her first tooth. The other was learning the old ways of healing from his grandfather. They didn't speak much before they left. They just packed what they could: dried fish wrapped in leaves, roasted yams, a gourd for water, and a small knife for protection. The whole village came out to see them off. No speeches, just hands on shoulders, eyes holding eyes a second too long, and quiet blessings whispered like secrets. "Bring back help," an elder said, pressing a small woven charm into one of their palms. "Or don't come back at all." The journey was brutal from the first step. Rain turned the narrow trails into slick mudslides. Leeches dropped from branches. At night, they huddled under tarps made of banana leaves, listening to the howls of wild dogs and the rustle of things they couldn't see. They ate grubs and wild berries when their food ran out. Once they had to cross a river swollen by rain, holding hands, stepping carefully on mossy stones, hearts hammering with every slip. Another time they climbed a ridge so steep they had to pull themselves up by roots, their fingers raw and bleeding. They walked until their feet blistered, then walked some more. They slept only when exhaustion forced them down. They kept going because turning back wasn't an option. Every step was a prayer. On the 8th day, half delirious with hunger and fatigue, they stumbled into a small mission outpost near a bend in the Sepik River. A missionary who'd lived in the region for over 20 years saw them coming and ran out barefoot. He took one look at their sunken eyes, their trembling hands, and knew this wasn't just tired travelers. It was an emergency. Inside the hut, over warm tea and rice, they told their story in broken English mixed with gestures. "Sickness. Many dying. No medicine. Please. Help." The words were simple, but the weight behind them filled the room. The missionary had no vehicle, no doctor on call. But he had one lifeline, a satellite phone kept locked in a metal box for true emergencies. He'd used it only twice before. Once during a landslide, once when a child needed surgery no local healer could perform. He opened the box now, dialed a number he'd memorized, and spoke slowly into the static-filled line. "This is Father Eli. I've got 2 young men here from a village called Karima. They say half their people are sick. Some have died. No access, no help. They need medicine. Now." The call barely held, but the message got through. That night, while the 2 young men slept on thin mats, wrapped in donated blankets, The missionary sat at his old laptop. He typed out a short message, just the facts, no drama, and posted it on a few humanitarian networks he trusted. He didn't expect much. Big aid groups moved slowly. Governments needed paperwork. By the time help arrived, it might be too late. But the internet has a strange way of connecting the right people at the right time. His post was seen by a nurse in Brisbane who'd worked in remote clinics. She shared it with a former field medic she knew. He passed it to a small, low-profile group called the Phoenix Initiative, a team few had heard of, but those who had never forgot them. They weren't funded by governments. They didn't wear matching uniforms or give interviews. Most of them had grown up in places where survival wasn't a choice, it was a daily fight. War zones, refugee camps, regions hit by famine or flood. They'd been the ones begging for help once. Now they were the ones answering the call. When the message reached them, late at night in a modest office above a repair shop in Nairobi, they didn't hold a meeting. They didn't debate budgets. One of them read it aloud. Another checked their medical stock. A third called a pilot they'd helped during a drought in the Horn of Africa. "We've got a village in PNG," they said. Sick, isolated, no time. Within hours, they were packing. IV fluids, antibiotics, water purification tablets, wound dressings, even basic tools to test water quality. They knew from hard experience that in places like Karima, you don't just bring medicine, you bring the knowledge to use it, the strength to carry it, and the will to stay until it's enough. Back in the village, days dragged on. The sick grew weaker. The healthy grew quieter. The two young men hadn't returned. Some began to lose hope. They started digging shallow graves on the hillside just in case. Children stopped playing. Even the pigs seemed to sense the sadness in the air. No one in Korima knew that, high above the clouds, a small cargo plane was already turning south, its engines humming through the night. Inside, a handful of people scarred by their own pasts, hardened by loss but fiercely alive, were flying toward them. Not because they were heroes, but because they remembered what it felt like to be invisible, to be forgotten, to send a cry into the silence and wonder if anyone would ever hear. The villagers had pleaded. For help, they had no idea who would answer, and they certainly didn't know that. The ones coming weren't ordinary rescuers, but people who'd stared death in the face so many times they no longer feared it. They only feared doing nothing. So while Karima waited in the rain and the dark, help was already on the way. Fast, quiet, and real. Not with fanfare, not with cameras, just with hands ready to work, hearts that remembered, and the stubborn belief that no one should have to die alone. Most people imagine aid workers as gentle souls in clean vests, handing out supplies with calm smiles. But the truth is, help doesn't always come wrapped in kindness. Sometimes it arrives rough around the edges, worn boots, tired eyes, and hands that have seen too much. That's exactly who answered Karima's call. The group that stepped off the small cargo plane wasn't like any rescue team you'd see on the news. They didn't carry banners or pose for photos. They moved fast, quiet, and with a kind of focus that made even the jungle seem to hold its breath. These were people who'd grown up where life wasn't promised. It was fought for. One had survived a civil war as a child, hiding in cassava fields while soldiers burned villages nearby. Another had spent years treating gunshot wounds in a basement clinic with no electricity. A third had walked for weeks across a desert with nothing but a plastic bottle and a torn map, just to find safety. They called themselves the Phoenix Initiative, not because they liked grand names, but because they'd all risen from ashes in one way or another. Most big aid organizations wouldn't hire them. Too intense, they'd say, too unpredictable. But in places where rules don't matter and time is measured in heartbeats, people like them weren't a risk. They were the only hope. When they heard about Karima, it wasn't just another mission. It hit close to home. The description, remote, cut off, watching loved ones die while the world looked away, sounded painfully familiar. So they didn't wait for permission. They packed what they could, called in a favor with a pilot who owed them his life, and flew through the night. Now standing on the muddy airstrip carved into a hillside near the mission outpost, they loaded their gear onto porters hired from a nearby village. No fancy vehicles, no drones, just backpacks, medical crates, and determination. They knew the last leg of the journey would be on foot, through the same brutal trails the two young men from Karima had taken. And they were ready. As they walked, they didn't talk much. Not because they were unfriendly, but because silence was a habit. In the places they came from, noise could get you killed. They scanned the trees, listened to the birds, watched the ground for snakes or hidden holes. Every step was careful, every breath measured. They moved like people who'd learned long ago that survival isn't about being brave. It's about being smart, fast, and never letting your guard down completely. Along the way, they shared small things, bits of dried fruit, a sip of clean water, a hand to pull someone over a slippery rock. No big speeches, just quiet acts of care. That's how they built trust, with actions, not words. Back in the capital cities of the world, people might have called them damaged or unstable. But out here, in the real world where help means the difference between life and death, their so-called rough edges were actually strengths. They could sleep on wet ground. They could treat a wound with a needle and thread. They could stay calm when a child stopped breathing. They'd done it all before. What set them apart wasn't just their skills, it was their understanding. They didn't see the people of Karima as victims. They saw them as survivors, just like they once were. And that changed everything. When they finally reached the edge of the village on the morning of the 10th day, they didn't march in like saviors. They stopped at the tree line, observed quietly, and waited to be seen. They knew that showing up unannounced with strange gear and loud voices could scare people who were already terrified. It didn't take long. A boy tending pigs spotted them first. He froze, then ran shouting into the village. Within minutes, elders appeared at the edge of the clearing, gripping walking sticks like weapons. Their faces were wary, eyes sharp with suspicion. Outsiders had brought trouble before. Miners, loggers, even well-meaning tourists who left behind trash and broken promises. But these newcomers didn't smile too wide. They didn't reach for cameras. One of them slowly knelt, opened a pack, and pulled out a small bottle of rehydration salts. Then, in halting but respectful local dialect, learned from old field manuals and a crash course on the plane, they said, "We heard your people are sick. We brought medicine." An elder stepped forward, eyes narrowed. "Who sent you?" "No one," came the reply. "We came because we remember what it's like to beg and hear nothing." That simple sentence hung in the air. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. But it was true. And in a place where words are weighed by their weight in truth, not charm, it mattered. Slowly, the tension eased. A woman brought them water in a coconut shell. A man pointed to the longhouse where the sickest lay. And just like that, without fanfare or paperwork, help began. The villagers watched in silence as these strangers, dressed in faded clothes, faces lined with old pain, set up a makeshift clinic under a tarp. They boiled water over a fire. They sorted pills into small paper cups. They checked pulses with fingers that had once trembled from fear, but now moved with steady purpose. One of them knelt beside a child too weak to sit up. Without a word, they mixed clean water with salts and sugar, then gently lifted the child's head and helped them sip. Minutes later, the child's eyes fluttered open, just a little, but it was enough to make the mother sob with relief. That moment said more than any introduction ever could. These weren't polished heroes from a brochure. They were real people, scarred, tired, and deeply human, who carried not just medicine, but something even rarer, understanding. They knew what it felt like to watch someone you loved slip away while you stood helpless, and because of that, they wouldn't stand by now. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over Korima, the villagers began to relax. Not because the danger was over, but because for the first time in weeks they weren't alone. And the ones who'd come to help, they didn't feel like rescuers. They felt like they'd finally come home, not to a place but to a purpose, to turn their pain into protection, their past into a promise. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just about saving lives. It was about remembering that even the most broken people can become someone else's lifeline. When the strangers first walked into Karima, the villagers didn't know what to make of them. They didn't look like the missionaries who sometimes passed through, clean-shaven, soft-spoken, always smiling. These people moved differently. Their eyes scanned the trees like they expected danger. Their hands were rough, scarred in places, and never stayed still for long. Some carried long sticks that looked like rifles, though they never pointed them at anyone. The children hid behind their mothers. Even the dogs stayed quiet. At first, no one spoke. The villagers watched from doorways and under eaves as the newcomers set up camp near the edge of the village. Not too close, not too far. They didn't ask for food. They didn't demand space. They just got to work. Boiling water in dented pots, laying out clean cloths on flat stones, opening wooden boxes filled with strange tools and small paper packets. An elder finally stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Why are you here?" One of the strangers looked up, wiped sweat from their brow, and answered simply, "You asked for help. We came, that was it. No grand speech, no promises of miracles, just those few words spoken like they were stating the weather." Still, trust didn't come easy. The villagers had been let down before. Outsiders would show up, take photos, hand out a few pills, and vanish, leaving behind more questions than answers. So they watched. They waited. They kept their distance. But then something changed. A little girl, no older than 5, had been lying still for 2 days, too weak to cry, her breathing shallow. Her mother sat beside her, rocking back and forth, whispering old songs that hadn't worked. One of the newcomers noticed. Without asking, they knelt beside the mat, felt the child's forehead, checked her gums, then quietly mixed something in a small cup. It was just clean water, salt, and sugar, but to the villagers it looked like magic. They held the cup to the girl's lips. At first nothing, then a tiny sip, then another. Within an hour the child's eyes opened. Not wide, not laughing, but awake, present. Her fingers twitched, reaching for her mother's hand. The mother didn't say, "Thank you." She didn't need to. She just pressed her forehead to the stranger's shoulder and wept. That moment broke the ice. After that, people started coming forward, not in crowds, but one by one. A man with a deep cut on his leg that had turned angry red. A grandmother coughing so hard she couldn't sleep. A teenager with a fever that wouldn't break. Each time, the strangers treated them with quiet care. No rushing, no shouting. Just steady hands and calm voices. They didn't just hand out medicine. They showed people how to use it. "This leaf," one of them said, holding up a plant the villagers knew well. "Boil it with this powder. Drink twice a day." They pointed to the river. "This water looks clear, but it's not safe. See this cloth? Fold it like this, pour water through it, then leave it in the sun for 6 hours. That kills the bad things you can't see." The villagers listened, not because they were told to, but because they saw these strangers doing the same things themselves, drinking only treated water, washing their hands before touching the sick, sleeping on the ground like everyone else. Slowly, fear turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into respect. The children were the first to lose their shyness. They'd peek from behind trees, then creep closer, watching as the strangers stitched a wound with needle and thread, or made a splint from bamboo. One boy finally gathered the courage to ask, "Are you spirits?" The stranger laughed, a real tired laugh, and shook their head. "No, just people who've been sick before, and lost people, and learned how to fight back." That answer meant more than any title or uniform ever could. As days passed, the camp became part of village life. The strangers shared their food, simple rice and beans, and accepted sweet potatoes in return. They helped rebuild a roof damaged by rain. They sat by the fire at night, not speaking much, but listening to stories. And sometimes, when the fire burned low, they'd share their own, quietly, carefully, about places where the sky rained fire, or where children walked for days with no shoes, or where help never came at all. The villagers didn't fully understand those stories, but they heard the pain in them, and they realized something important. These people weren't here because they thought Karima was helpless. They were here because they saw themselves in Karima's struggle. One morning, a young man who'd barely spoken since the sickness began brought the strangers a basket of fresh fruit. He didn't say anything, just placed it down and nodded. It was his way of saying, "We see you. We trust you." By then, the worst of the illness had passed. Fewer people were falling sick. Those who were ill were getting stronger. The fields were being tended again. Laughter returned, soft at first, then louder. The strangers never acted like heroes. They never took credit. When someone thanked them, they'd just shrug and say, "You did the hard part, holding on until help came." But the truth was, both sides had saved each other. The villagers had given the strangers something they hadn't felt in years, a place where their scars weren't seen as brokenness, but as proof they'd survived. And the strangers had given the villagers more than medicine. They'd given them back their dignity. They hadn't come to fix them. They'd come to stand with them, and in that quiet understanding something powerful grew. Not just healing, but hope. No one knew how long the strangers would stay. But for now, under the same sky, sharing the same fire, they were no longer outsiders and villagers. They were just people, helping people. As the days turned into weeks, something quiet but powerful began to take root in Karima. Not just recovery, but a new kind of strength. The worst of the sickness had passed, but the real work was just beginning. The strangers didn't pack up and leave once people stopped dying. Instead, they stayed, not as rescuers, but as teachers. They knew that handing out medicine was only a temporary fix. Real help meant making sure the village never had to beg for it again. So they started showing people how to protect themselves, not with fancy tools or expensive machines, but with what the land already offered and a little bit of knowledge. One morning, they gathered a small group near the riverbank. "This water," one of them said, scooping a handful, "looks clean. But it's full of tiny things that make you sick." They didn't use big words like bacteria or pathogens. They just called them invisible enemies. Then they showed how to build a simple filter using layers of sand, charcoal from the fire, and clean gravel inside a hollowed-out bamboo stalk. "Pour the river water through this," they explained, "and most of the bad stuff gets caught." The villagers watched, then tried it themselves. When they saw how clear the water became, their eyes lit up, not with amazement but with understanding. This wasn't magic. It was something they could do every day with their own hands. Next came the sun. "You don't need pills for everything," another one said, holding up a clear plastic bottle filled with river water. "Just this in the sun." They explained how leaving water in a clear bottle in direct sunlight for 6 hours kills the invisible enemies inside. It sounded too simple to be true, but when they tested it with strips from their kit, the water really was safer. The elders nodded slowly. "Our grandparents said the sun cleanses," one murmured. "We forgot." That became the pattern. Not replacing old ways, but weaving new knowledge into them. They taught mothers how to spot early signs of dehydration in children: dry lips, sunken eyes, no tears when crying, and how to mix the salt-sugar solution before it got too late. They showed hunters how to boil bandages made from clean cloth to keep wounds from turning bad. They even helped dig a new pit latrine far from the water source, explaining how sickness spreads when waste gets into drinking water. But the most important lessons weren't about medicine. They were about mindset. One evening, as the fire crackled and children played nearby, one of the strangers sat with a group of young villagers. "Where I grew up," they said quietly, "there was no clinic, no doctor. When my little sister got sick, we used spiderwebs on her cuts. They helped stop bleeding. We ate clay when there was no food. It fills your stomach even if it doesn't feed you. We boiled leaves for fever because that's all we had." The villagers listened, stunned. They'd always thought people from the outside world lived in ease and comfort, but here was someone who'd survived on less than they had, and lived to tell about it. "We didn't wait for help," the stranger went on. "We learned to help ourselves. And that's what I see in you. You're strong. You just needed a few tools, and someone to remind you that you already have what it takes." Those words landed deep. For so long, the villagers had felt small, forgotten, powerless. But now they saw their own resilience reflected in the eyes of these outsiders. It wasn't pity they saw, it was respect. Soon the villagers began teaching the strangers too. They showed them which mushrooms were safe, how to track wild pigs without making noise, how to read the clouds before a storm. It became a two-way exchange, no one above, no one below. Just people sharing what they knew to keep each other alive. One afternoon, a landslide after heavy rain blocked the main trail to the nearest stream. In the past, the village might have panicked, fearing another water crisis. But this time, a young man who'd watched the strangers build filters stood up and said, "We can dig a new channel, use rocks to guide the water, and treat it before we drink." Others joined him. Within a day, they'd rerouted a clean flow and filtered it just like they'd been shown. The strangers watched from a distance, smiling to themselves. That was the moment they knew their work was taking hold. Not when people followed orders, but when they started thinking for themselves. Even the children changed. Instead of just playing, They practiced wrapping pretend wounds with leaves. They collected clean rainwater in gourds. They reminded their parents to wash hands before meals. The knowledge was spreading, not through lectures but through daily life, and through it all the strangers never acted like experts. They made mistakes too. Once they misidentified a plant and had to be corrected by an elder. Instead of being embarrassed, they thanked him and added it to their notes. "We're learning too," they said. That honesty built more trust than any perfect performance ever could. As the village grew stronger, so did the bond between them. Meals were shared, songs were exchanged. At night, stories flowed both ways. Tales of mountain spirits and jungle ghosts from Karima, and quiet memories of survival from lands far away. No one talked about leaving, but everyone knew it would happen soon. Still, the focus remained on the future. The strangers helped the villagers write down what they'd learned. Simple drawings and symbols on bark paper so the knowledge wouldn't be lost when the elders passed on. "This isn't just for now," they said. "It's for your children's children." And in teaching others how to survive, the strangers found something they hadn't expected: healing for themselves. For years they'd carried guilt, grief, the weight of all they couldn't save. But here, in this quiet village, they were finally using their pain for something good. Not to fix the past, but to protect the future. By the time the rainy season began to ease, Karima wasn't just recovering. It was ready. Not because outsiders had swooped in and saved the day, but because ordinary people, armed with simple tools and renewed confidence, had decided to take care of their own, and that, more than any medicine, was the real cure. The day the strangers packed to leave, no one made a big show of it. There were no speeches, no tears in front of everyone, no promises to never forget. In Karima, goodbyes were quiet, like the way the mist lifts off the mountains at dawn, slow and sure. But that didn't mean it wasn't felt. For weeks they'd lived side by side, sharing food, mending roofs, tending the sick, laughing over small things like a stubborn goat or a pot that boiled over. The villagers had stopped seeing them as outsiders. They were just people who'd come when no one else did, stayed when they could have left, and taught without making anyone feel small. Now, as they rolled up their tarps and tied their packs, the whole village gathered, not to say goodbye, but to walk with them part of the way. It was the highest honor they could give. Children carried extra water gourds. Women pressed bundles of smoked fish and roasted yams into their hands. Elders walked in silence, their presence saying more than words ever could. Halfway down the trail, one of the strangers stopped, turned, and looked back at the village nestled in the green folds of the mountain. They didn't speak, but their eyes held something deep, gratitude maybe, or peace. For so long, they'd carried the weight of all the places they couldn't save, all the people they'd lost. But here, in this forgotten corner of the world, they'd actually made a difference, not by being perfect, but by showing up, tired, scarred, and real. And Karima had given them something just as precious, the chance to be useful again. To turn their pain into protection. To remember that survival isn't just about staying alive, it's about helping others do the same. Back in the village, life didn't go back to how it was before. It moved forward. The knowledge the strangers left behind took root like a strong vine. When the next sickness came, a stomach bug from a visiting trader, the villagers didn't panic. They boiled water, gave the salt sugar drink, and kept the sick isolated until they recovered. No one died. No one had to walk 10 days through the jungle begging for help, but they didn't keep that strength to themselves. A few months later, heavy rains caused flooding in a neighboring valley. Word reached Karima that another village, smaller, even more isolated, was cut off, with no clean water and children falling ill. Without waiting for outsiders, a group from Karima packed supplies: filtered water in gourds, bundles of medicinal leaves, and bark paper instructions on how to treat fever and dehydration. They walked for 3 days through muddy trails to reach them. When they arrived, they didn't act like heroes. They just set up camp, shared what they knew, and worked alongside the people there, just as the strangers had done for them. "We were helped once," they said simply. "Now it's our turn." That ripple kept spreading. One village taught another. A young man from Karima later traveled to a regional meeting and shared their water filter method with health workers. It wasn't fancy, but it worked, and it cost almost nothing. Soon, similar filters started appearing in other remote communities. Meanwhile, far away, the strangers returned to their base, a modest house near a busy market in a city that never slept. The world outside buzzed with noise, traffic, and endless distractions. But inside, things were quiet. One of them sat at a small wooden table late at night, writing in a worn notebook by lamplight. Not a report, not a log, just thoughts. We went to save them, they wrote. But they reminded us we were still human, that our scars aren't just wounds, they're proof we lived through something, and that living through something means we can help others live through it too. They didn't post about it online, didn't seek praise, but that truth stayed with them, like a warm stone in a pocket. Sometimes people assume that those who've seen the worst of the world become cold or broken, but the opposite is often true. The ones who've stared into the dark are the ones who learn to carry light, not for glory, but because they know how much it matters when you're lost in the shadows. Karima never became famous. You won't find it on news headlines or charity brochures, but in the quiet rhythm of daily life, the clean water drawn from filtered streams, the children playing without fear of sudden fever, the elders teaching the young how to heal with both plants and patience, the village thrived in its own way. And the strangers? They kept going. To other places, other cries for help. But now they carried Karima with them, not as a memory but as a reminder. A reminder that real help isn't about grand gestures. It's about showing up, staying humble, and trusting that even the most ordinary people can become each other's lifeline. Years later, if you visit Karima, you'll see a small garden near the edge of the village. In it grow not just food but medicinal plants, neatly labeled with simple carvings on bamboo sticks. Children learn their uses in school. Visitors are shown how to make clean water with just a bottle and the sun. And every so often someone looks up at the sky when a plane passes overhead, not with fear but with quiet hope, because they know now the world is bigger than their mountain. And sometimes when you send a cry into the silence, the right people hear it, not because they're perfect but because they've been there too. In the end, no one saved anyone. They simply chose to stand together. And in that choice, they found something stronger than survival. They found dignity. They found trust. They found the quiet truth that even in the hardest places on earth, kindness doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. And the most broken people can become the ones who heal the world, one village, one heart at a time.